I opened the door to my old bedroom and stopped so suddenly the handle rattled in my hand. There was a suitcase on my bed, not mine. A glossy maroon case, the kind you buy new for a cruise or a honeymoon, still wearing the paper tag from the airport. It was sprawled across the quilt I'd sewn myself 15 years ago, the one with the uneven navy stitches and a corner that never quite laid flat. Beside it, a floral scarf draped casually over the chair where I used to sit and read before bed. A bottle of perfume sat on the nightstand, next to an open paperback, someone else's half-drunk glass of water. I stepped inside slowly, like the air might be different here. And it was. Not the faint lavender I'd always kept in a sachet by the pillows, but a sharp, expensive floral, the kind that leaves a trail behind you in grocery aisles. The closet door stood open. My clothes, my carefully folded sweaters, my extra pair of slippers were gone. Just empty hangers swinging gently, like they'd been brushed aside. I turned, trying to find something familiar, something that still belonged to me. But the only thing left was the view. The maple tree outside, its branches bare against a pale winter sky. Even that looked different somehow. The voice came from behind me. "Oh, Margaret, you found your way down here already." Claire stood in the doorway, her smile wide enough to be polite, but not enough to reach her eyes. She was holding her phone in one hand, her other resting on the doorframe like she owned the place. Which, I reminded myself, she didn't. Not all of it. "I didn't realize anyone was staying in here," I said. My voice came out softer than I intended, like I was the guest who had made the mistake. "Oh yes, just for the weekend," she said, stepping inside as if to guide me out. "My sister flew in for the dinner. We thought she'd be more comfortable upstairs. We set you up in the basement guest room. It's cozy. You'll love it." She brushed past me to pluck a sweater off the bed, her sister's, I assumed, and smiled again, tighter this time. "You don't mind, do you?" I almost said no, of course not. The way I've said it 100 times in my life when someone took something small and called it nothing. But instead, I just nodded once, the kind of nod you give when the decision's already been made for you. Out in the hallway, the sound of laughter floated up from downstairs, the kind of warm, clinking glass laughter that smells like roasted meat and fresh bread, the kind that belongs to people who feel perfectly at home. I carried my small overnight bag down the back stairs to the basement. The light was dim, the ceiling low enough that I had to duck near the laundry alcove. The guest room was a rectangle with no windows, a single bed pushed against the wall, and a lamp with a crooked shade. The air was cool and a little damp. Someone had left a candle on the dresser, still in its plastic wrap, like an afterthought. I set my bag on the bed and sat beside it. The mattress sighed under my weight. From here, the faint thump of footsteps echoed through the ceiling. I could picture exactly where they were walking. Across the kitchen tiles, down the hallway, into the dining room that looked out over the backyard. I stayed there for a long moment, my hands resting on my knees, staring at the neat stack of towels someone had placed on the chair. White, hotel style, folded with crisp edges, impersonal, prepared for a guest, not for me. After a while, I made my way back upstairs. The hallway smelled faintly of fresh paint and lemon polish. Family photos lined the wall, David with the kids on a fishing trip, Claire in a wide sun hat holding a glass of wine. But in all the frames I passed, there was only one that had me in it. A photo from 5 years ago, my face half turned as if I hadn't been ready. In the kitchen, Claire was arranging a platter of appetizers, her sister leaning against the counter, sipping wine. David was at the stove, stirring something in a pot, his back to me. "Mom," he said over his shoulder, "you made it." "We were just talking about how nice it'll be to have you here for the heritage dinner. You're going to love all the changes we've made." I glanced out the window toward the patio. Even from here, I could see the soft glow of string lights hung above the deck, the glint of polished glassware on the long table outside. Every chair was already set, every place card neatly written in gold ink. But there was something about the way David said it, the changes we've made, that sat oddly in my stomach. I smiled, though it felt thin on my face. "I'm sure it's beautiful," I said. And as I stood there, taking in the smell of rosemary and roasted chicken, the clink of serving spoons against ceramic, I couldn't shake the sense that something else had already been set in motion long before I arrived, something I wasn't meant to see. If you'd asked me a week earlier where home was, I would have told you about my little 2-bedroom apartment above the old bakery on Hawthorne Street. It's not fancy. Linoleum floors in the kitchen, a water heater that rattles on cold mornings. But it's mine. Every wall has something I chose to hang. The sunlight falls just right across the small table where I read the paper with my coffee. And best of all, nobody moves my things without asking. I've been there 10 years now, ever since I sold the house David grew up in. That was the deal. My late husband Richard and I had saved enough equity that when the time came, we could help our only son buy something bigger for his own family. I signed over the proceeds from the sale to cover half the down payment on this very house I was now visiting. The papers said tenancy in common, which meant I still legally owned my share. But I never thought much about that part. Back then, it felt like we were all just one family, one table, one roof. That first summer after they moved in, I helped paint the porch rails and plant hydrangeas along the fence. I was here for Sunday dinners, birthday barbecues in the backyard, 4th of July fireworks viewed from lawn chairs on the deck. If they needed a sitter for the kids, I came without question. I was still working part-time at the library then, but my schedule was flexible. I liked being useful. It's funny looking back how usefulness can become a currency you're expected to keep paying without ever checking the balance. Claire came into the family a few years after Richard passed. She was warm at first, in that shiny new relationship way, leaning in to hug me at their engagement party, telling me how much she admired the way I kept the family together after losing my husband. But over time, her warmth cooled into something more polite than personal. Invitations started coming later. Conversations turned into quick updates while she glanced at her phone. And little by little, I felt myself being nudged to the edges. It wasn't dramatic, not then. Just a place card at the far end of the table. We already have dessert covered when I offered to bake. Family photos posted online that included my hands on a grandchild's shoulder, but never my face. That's why the phone call last month had surprised me. She'd sounded almost giddy. "Margaret, we're finally done with the renovations. We're having a special family heritage dinner. It wouldn't be the same without you. You have to come see the place." I'd hesitated for only a second before agreeing. I told myself this was the olive branch we needed, that maybe I'd misread the past couple of years, and this was her way of pulling me back in. I bought a new cardigan for the trip, soft heather gray, the kind that drapes nice, and spent 2 days baking my cranberry orange cake, the one David always asked for as a boy. I wrapped it in wax paper and tucked it carefully in my bag, imagining it in the center of their new dining table. Now, standing in their kitchen with the smell of rosemary chicken in the air, I couldn't help noticing how smoothly Claire and her sister moved around each other, a practiced rhythm of shared space. My presence felt like a pebble dropped into a pond that had already found its balance. "Here, Mom," David said, handing me a bundle of silverware. "Can you set the side table on the patio? We're keeping the main table inside for guests. Easier that way." Guests. I took the silverware without a word and stepped out onto the patio. The late afternoon light slanted across the deck, catching the golden rims of the wine glasses. The main table stretched nearly the length of the deck, dressed in cream linen, dotted with candles and glass holders. Each place card was a neat triangle of heavy paper with names written in looping gold ink. I scanned them without meaning to. David, Claire, her sister, her parents, a couple of friends I didn't know. My name wasn't there. On the small folding table in the corner, the one David had just asked me to set, There were 4 chairs, plastic, no candles, no place cards. I stood there longer than I meant to, the silverware growing heavy in my hands. Back inside, Claire's laughter floated in from the front hallway. I caught pieces of her conversation with her sister. Once the title's streamlined into our names, we can finally take out the next loan. Think he'll go for it? He doesn't really have a choice. Mom's already on board. They didn't notice me at the sink, rinsing a handful of herbs. My back stiffened, but I kept my head down. There was no mention of me in that title talk. No acknowledgement of whose name was still on the deed. By the time the first guests arrived, I'd pressed the thought into a tight, silent corner of my mind. I greeted people, poured drinks, passed plates, smiled when someone complimented the new house. All the while, I kept catching glimpses of the upstairs hallway where my old bedroom sat, now holding someone else's suitcase, someone else's perfume, someone else's glass of water on the nightstand. Dinner moved along in a blur. Claire was in her element, topping off wine glasses, telling stories about the chaos of renovations, laughing at her own punchlines. Every compliment about the house landed like a feather in her cap. I slipped away to the kitchen to refill the bread basket and glanced at my phone. A notification popped up from social media. One of those, "You might like this" nudges. It was Claire's post. A photo of the dining table, lit softly by candles. Everyone smiling, glasses raised. The caption read, "Family all together tonight." I stared at it, trying to place the moment it was taken. Then I realized I was in the kitchen at the time, slicing bread. The bread knife was still in my hand when I heard Claire's voice behind me. "Everything okay?" I turned, managing a small smile. "Just topping off the bread." She nodded, already glancing back toward her guests. I put the bread on the counter and stepped out onto the back porch for a breath of cool air. The sky was streaked with the last colors of sunset, the air sharp with the scent of pine from the neighbor's yard. From here, I could see my reflection faintly in the glass door. Cardigan neat, hair smoothed. The picture of a welcome guest, but inside I could feel something else building. Not anger exactly, not yet. Something quieter, something patient. By the time I stepped back inside, the house felt even warmer. Not from welcome, but from the swell of bodies and conversation that had nothing to do with me. I eased past the main table, careful not to bump anyone's chair. The candles were already burning low, their wax pooling in small silver dishes. Claire's sister caught my eye just long enough to give a faint smile, the kind you offer a stranger you've been told to be polite to. I set the bread down, waited for someone to make room, but no one did. Their conversations folded neatly over me, like I'd never been there at all. David was talking to a couple I didn't recognize, a tall man in a tailored sweater and a woman with a diamond the size of a grape on her left hand. "We just had the kitchen redone," he was saying. "Claire really drove the vision. She's got such a good eye for design." The woman leaned in, admiring the marble countertops. "Gorgeous," she said. "And all this space. You're so lucky you got in when you did. These houses are impossible to find now." David grinned. That easy, proud grin I used to think was for me. "Yeah, we timed it right." Not a word about the timing, the money, or the signature that made it possible. I caught myself tightening my grip on the breadbasket, loosened it before the wicker left marks in my palms. At the far end of the table, Claire was topping off wine glasses. Her mother sat beside her, laughing at something the sister had said. "Oh, this house is perfect for you two," her mother told them. "It's exactly what you deserve." Claire didn't glance my way when she said, "It's been a long time coming." I slipped into the kitchen, telling myself it was just to refill the water pitcher. From there, I could hear them but not see them. The walls seemed to make the words sharper, as if they knew where to cut. "So what's next?" the man with the diamond-wearing wife asked. "Once the title's sorted, we can take out the next loan," Claire's voice answered. "We're thinking new deck, maybe a pool." A pause, then a laugh. "She doesn't even know, does she?" "We're handling it," Claire said lightly. "It's delicate." The laugh again. "Delicate," the man repeated. "That's one word for it." I poured water into the pitcher and stared at the stream as if I could fall into it. When I brought it back to the table, Claire looked up brightly. "There you are. We were wondering if you got lost." The table chuckled. Not cruelly, but in that easy way people do when they're not thinking about who's on the other end of the joke. "I'm fine," I said, placing the pitcher down. My voice was steady, but it felt like a wire pulled too tight. The rest of dinner moved in small cuts. Someone mistaking my cranberry orange cake for a store-bought loaf and barely touching it. My grandson's seat pulled closer to Claire's parents, so he was out of arm's reach. A story about first memories in the house that began the year after I'd signed over my share of the money. By dessert, I was running out of small smiles. Claire's sister leaned toward me as she served herself. "I hope the basement's okay for you." I told Claire it might be damp, but she said you'd be fine. "You're not picky, right?" Her tone was light, conversational, but the words landed like a reminder that my comfort was something to be managed, not considered. "It's fine," I said. My fork scraped the plate louder than I meant it to. I watched the table laugh at another story from Claire's father, something about a fishing trip gone wrong, and I couldn't shake the image of my old bedroom upstairs. How quickly a space stops being yours when someone else moves into it. How even the air changes. The evening carried on until the plates were stacked, the wine bottles emptied, and people began drifting toward the living room. I stayed back to help clear the table. It was habit. Years of Sunday dinners at my own kitchen table had trained me to gather plates without thinking. I was stacking them at the sink when I heard Claire's voice behind me, lowered just enough for me to know it wasn't meant for everyone. "Mom says once everything's in our name, we should think about converting the basement. Could be a rental, bring in extra income." She said it like the space she'd sent me to sleep in tonight was already a thing to sell. I turned, plate in hand, but she was already walking back toward the living room. The sound of laughter swelled again, but this time it felt like it was coming from the other side of a locked door. I left the plates in the sink and stood in the hallway for a moment, my eyes drifting to the framed photo from 5 years ago, the only one with me in it. I remembered the day. I'd been caught mid-laugh, hair windblown from the backyard. Richard had been gone a year, and I'd been trying so hard to be part of the noise again. Now I was just outside of it. David appeared in the hall then, smiling like nothing was wrong. "Hey, Mom, come sit with us. We're talking about summer plans. You'll like this." I followed him into the living room and sat on the far end of the couch. The conversation rolled over me. Vacation rentals, pool parties, Claire's idea for a new outdoor kitchen. Every detail sounded like money spent on a life I was watching through glass. And then, without thinking, I spoke. "What about me?" It was quiet enough that only David and Claire heard. David's smile faltered. "What do you mean?" I looked at him, then at her. "You've been talking about changes, about loans, about ownership." I let the last word hang. "Does any of it include me?" Claire's eyes flicked to the others in the room, then back to me. "This isn't the time, Margaret." My son shifted in his seat. "Let's not do this right now, okay?" It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel, but it was dismissal, plain and simple. Something in me stilled, the way water does when the wind stops. I smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that invites anyone closer. "All right," I said. "Not right now." I stood and excused myself to the kitchen, the murmur of conversation swelling back to life behind me. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water and stared out the window at the string lights swaying gently in the night breeze. They looked so lovely from here, warm, inviting, and I thought, not for the first time that night, how easy it is to make something look welcoming from the outside. What people can't see is who's not invited to sit under it. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, I lay awake in the basement guest room listening to the hum of the furnace. Upstairs, a floor above me, the life I'd helped build was sleeping under the roof I'd helped pay for. And yet, I was down here, a visitor in the only place I'd once called ours. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint outline of pipes and ductwork. Every creak from above sounded like a reminder. You are here on borrowed space. But there was something Claire and David didn't know. I still owned half of this house, and the only way they could take that from me was if I signed it away. The next morning, I slipped out before anyone else was up. The air was crisp and bright, the kind that makes the world look like it's been scrubbed clean overnight. I walked 3 blocks to the small cafe I'd spotted when I arrived, the kind with chipped mugs, a bell on the door, and a regular who reads the paper at the corner table every morning. I ordered tea and a plain bagel, sat by the window, and pulled out my phone. It had been years since I called Martin, but his number was still saved. Richard had trusted him. They'd gone to school together, and Martin had handled every bit of legal work for us since our first mortgage. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice deeper now, but still steady. "Margaret?" "Well, this is a surprise." I told him I was in town, staying with David and Claire. I told him, lightly, that there'd been some talk about ownership changes, and then I asked the question I already knew the answer to. "My name is still on the deed, right?" There was a pause, papers shuffling. "Yes, tenancy in common, which means your half is yours, free and clear. They can't touch it without your consent." I sipped my tea, letting the warmth sit in my chest. "And what if," I said slowly, "I wanted to protect that share? Make sure it only goes where I choose?" He didn't miss a beat. "We can put it in a trust, for anyone you name, education, housing, whatever terms you want. Once it's done, they can't change it." I thought of my grandson, David's boy, sitting at the far end of the table last night, pulled toward Claire's parents like a pawn moved in a game I wasn't allowed to play. I thought of the way he'd smiled at me when I arrived, shy but genuine. "For my grandson's education," I said, "and keep full control with me until I'm gone." Martin agreed to draw up the paperwork immediately. We arranged to meet at his office that afternoon. By the time I walked back to the house, the decision felt like it had been carved in stone. Claire was in the kitchen when I came in, wearing one of her spotless aprons, the smell of cinnamon rolls filling the air. She glanced at me over her shoulder. "Morning. Did you sleep all right down there?" "Fine," I said, hanging up my coat. David wandered in, hair still damp from the shower. "We're doing a big brunch. Later. You'll get to see more of the family. Everyone's excited." I smiled faintly. "Sounds nice." The morning passed in a blur of preparations. Platters stacked, champagne chilling in buckets, chairs rearranged. Guests began arriving early, hugging David and Claire in the entryway, shedding coats into the upstairs closet. I noticed how Claire made a point of introducing me last, as if I were a pleasant afterthought. "Oh, and this is Margaret, David's mom," she'd say with a quick smile before turning back to her conversation. By noon, the house was full again, louder than the night before. The dining room table gleamed under the overhead lights, place settings precise, name cards set out. I checked them once more, and still no seat for me at the main table. At 2:00, I slipped away again, this time without a word. The cab ride to Martin's office was short, 10 minutes through streets lined with bare trees and old brick storefronts. His office was on the 2nd floor of a narrow building, the kind with a brass nameplate on the door. Martin greeted me with a firm handshake. "I've got everything ready." We sat across from each other at his polished desk, the papers between us. He explained each clause carefully, his voice low and measured, like someone reading out a will. My half of the property, every legal right and value attached to it, would now be held in trust for my grandson's future education and related needs. I would remain in full control until my death. No one else could sell it, refinance it, or use it as collateral. When I signed the last page, Martin looked up at me. "You understand this will come as a shock to them." I met his gaze without hesitation. Good. Back at the house, the brunch was in full swing. Laughter, clinking glasses, someone playing soft jazz through the living room speakers. Claire spotted me as I stepped inside. "There you are. We were just about to toast. Come in, come in." I walked into the dining room, the trust documents folded neatly in my bag. Claire stood at the head of the table, glass in hand, David beside her. She tapped her glass with a fork. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate our newly renovated home. It's been such a journey, and we couldn't be happier to share it with the people who matter most." A chorus of "hear, hear" followed, and then, without raising my voice, I spoke. "If we're talking about the people who matter most," I said, "then I think it's only fair to be clear about who this home actually belongs to." The room fell into a silence so complete I could hear the soft fizz of champagne in my glass. I stepped forward, resting one hand lightly on the back of an empty chair. As of this morning, this house still has two owners, myself and David, and my half. I paused, letting the moment stretch. Is now legally secured in a trust for my grandson's education. A ripple went through the room. Claire's smile froze mid-curve. David's brow furrowed, his eyes darting to her and then back to me. "What are you talking about?" Claire said, her voice a shade too bright. "I'm talking about the deed," I replied calmly. "The one that's had my name on it since the day we bought this house. The one that means no changes can happen without my consent. And as of now, my consent is only for what benefits my grandson." There was a murmur from the guests, some shifting in their chairs, some pretending to look at their napkins. David took a step toward me. "Mom, this isn't the time?" I finished for him. "I think it's exactly the time. We're celebrating the house, after all." Claire's face had gone pale, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. "You blindsided us." I tilted my head slightly. Number I protected what's mine. For a long moment, no one moved. The music still played softly in the background, absurd against the tension tightening the air. Finally, I set my glass down on the table, the sound louder than it should have been. "Enjoy your dinner," I said evenly. "I'll leave you to it." I turned and walked toward the hallway, the murmur of voices rising behind me, confusion, questions, the sharp hiss of Claire whispering something to David. At the front door, I paused just long enough to slip my coat on. My hands didn't shake. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit my cheeks like clarity. That was the moment everything shifted. They could still smile at me, invite me to dinner, even ask me to pass the salt. But the balance of power had moved, quietly and permanently, to my side of the table, and I had no intention of handing it back. I didn't look back until I reached the bottom of the front steps. The winter light was low and blue, the kind that makes the air seem thinner. Behind me, the murmur of voices grew sharper. Through the window, I caught glimpses. David leaning toward Claire, her eyes darting toward the guests, the forced smile slipping every time someone asked a question. I'd left the documents in my bag, zipped and secure. I didn't need to wave them around. Words, when true, don't need proof in hand. They carry their own weight. I walked to the corner and stood for a moment, letting the cold settle into my coat. My breath puffed white in front of me, and for the first time all weekend, I didn't feel like I was taking up borrowed space. I could have kept walking, could have gone straight back to my hotel and caught an early train home, but some part of me, the part that had spent years smoothing over rough edges, making sure no one was embarrassed, wanted to give them the chance to choose a different path. So I turned back. Inside, the air was warmer, but tense, like a room that had just held an argument and was still ringing from it. Guests milled awkwardly in the living room, wine glasses cradled like shields. Claire stood by the dining table, her sister at her elbow, both of them talking in low, urgent tones. David was by the coat closet, running his hand over his hair the way he did as a boy when he was cornered. When he saw me, relief flickered in his eyes. "Mom," he started, stepping forward. "I'm not here to argue," I said. My voice was calm, steady. "I just wanted to say this. Nothing I've done is meant to punish you. It's meant to protect what I've worked for, what your father and I worked for. That's all." He nodded, but his gaze slipped toward Claire, who was watching from across the room. "I'll send you copies of the trust documents," I added, "so you understand exactly what it means." Claire's voice cut in, sharper than she meant it to. "We understand just fine." I turned to her, and for the first time all weekend, I let myself look at her without filtering. "Then you understand why this had to happen." For a moment, she held my gaze. Then she looked away, busying herself with stacking plates that didn't need stacking. I stepped closer to the table, rested my fingertips on the linen, and let my eyes sweep the room. "Enjoy your dinner," I said softly. "You don't need to worry about me taking anything from you. I'm only keeping what was already mine." No one spoke. The silence wasn't hostile. It was the kind that comes when something true has landed and people are still deciding what to do with it. I left quietly this time, without the prickling in my chest I'd felt earlier. Outside, the sky had deepened to indigo, the first stars breaking through. My cab pulled up just as I reached the curb. The driver was an older man, maybe my age, with silver hair and a kind face. "Cold night," he said as I slid into the back. "Yes," I said, glancing back once more at the house. The string lights over the deck still glowed, but they looked different now. Not so much warm and inviting as staged, like a photograph you can admire without wanting to step into. The hotel room was small but tidy. I set my bag on the chair and hung my coat, letting the quiet wrap around me. I made tea with the little kettle on the desk and sat by the window. Below, the streetlights cast long pools of gold onto the wet pavement. I thought of Richard, of the way he'd squeeze my hand under the table when someone tried to talk over me. "You don't have to be the loudest voice," he used to say. "Just make sure it's yours when you speak." Tonight it had been. The next morning, I took the late train home. The car was nearly empty, the hum of the tracks soothing after the noise of the past 2 days. I watched the landscape change. Bare fields, quiet towns, the occasional farmhouse with smoke curling from the chimney. Somewhere between stations, my phone buzzed. A text from David. "Mom, I'd like to talk when things settle down." I typed a short reply. "All right. I'll be here." No more chasing. No more filling in silences that weren't mine to fill. Back in my apartment, the radiator clanked to life, and the familiar scent of lavender from the sachet in my dresser drifted into the room. I set my bag down, took off my shoes, and went straight to the small kitchen. The cake I'd brought for the dinner was still there, untouched in its wax paper. I cut a generous slice, put it on one of my good plates, and sat at my table by the window. Outside, the street below was quiet, save for a dog walker bundled in a scarf and the faint glow from the bakery's neon sign. I took a bite, the tart cranberry and sweet orange just as I'd imagined it would taste. It wasn't about winning. It was about not losing myself. Later that evening, I pulled the trust documents from my bag and laid them on the table. I ran my fingers over the embossed seal, the weight of the paper. Then I slid them into a manila envelope, wrote my grandson's name across the front, and placed it in the drawer where I keep the things that matter most. The deed to my apartment, Richard's watch, the last letter he wrote me. Before closing the drawer, I added a small note on top. "For your future and for your choice. Love, Grandma." It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. The next morning, the sun poured through the window, lighting up the stack of dishes in the sink and the poinsettia I'd bought before the trip. I made coffee, poured it into my favorite mug, the one with the chipped handle, and carried it to the porch. A neighbor across the street was stringing lights along his railing, his breath visible in the cold air. He glanced over, waved. I waved back. The phone rang inside, but I didn't rush to answer it. Whoever it was could wait until my coffee was finished. I'd spent years answering every call, showing up at every request, bending to every timeline but my own. Those days were over. When I did go back inside, I noticed the envelope still sitting in the drawer, the ink of my grandson's name dark against the manila. I thought about calling him, about explaining everything right now, but then I remembered his last words to me before I left their house months ago. I like talking to you when we're not in a hurry. So I closed the drawer gently and decided to wait for the right moment. Because some things, the important things, are better delivered when the room is quiet and everyone is ready to listen. A week passed before David called again. This time his voice was softer. There was a hesitation in it, the way people sound when they're still trying to decide if they're calling for themselves or for someone else. He didn't apologize outright, not in so many words, but he did say, "Mom, I didn't realize how much all of this meant to you. I should have asked more questions before assuming anything." I let the pause stretch before I answered. "David, it's not just about what it means to me. It's about what it should mean to all of us. A family home isn't just a building. It's a piece of our story, and no one should be written out of their own story without consent." He murmured something in agreement. We didn't linger on the call. I didn't press him. Time, I knew, would do more work than any speech I could give. The days slipped back into their quiet rhythm. I met friends for coffee. I brought a book to the park on a mild afternoon, watching the bare branches scratch their shapes against the sky. I baked bread on Sunday and took a loaf to my neighbor who had just had surgery. Little things, but they added up to something steady, something that felt like living for myself again. Every so often I'd get a text from my grandson, a photo of his dog, a funny comment from school, or just thinking of you, Grandma. And each time I smiled, knowing that what I'd done at that dinner wasn't for revenge. It was for him, so that when the time came, he'd have more choices than I did at his age. One evening, I found myself tidying the small cedar box where I keep Richard's watch, our wedding photo, and the letters we wrote when he was stationed overseas. I added the envelope with the trust papers, tucking it between the folded letters. My handwriting on the front had started to fade a little. I traced over it with fresh ink, making sure his name was still bold and certain. I thought about the way people talk about family, like it's unbreakable by default. But in truth, family is like glass. It's strong enough to last generations if cared for, but fragile enough to shatter when handled carelessly. And once it cracks, you have to decide, patch it with gold and let the scars show, or sweep up the pieces and protect yourself from the shards. A month later, I ran into Claire at the grocery store. It was one of those awkward moments where you see someone too late to pretend you haven't. She had a cart full of fresh flowers and baguettes, wearing that crisp, curated look she always favored. We exchanged polite hellos. She didn't mention the house, and I didn't either. But I noticed something different. Her tone lacked the pointed edge it once had. Maybe it was just the distance. Maybe it was that she finally understood I wasn't the weak link she'd assumed. As I walked away, I realized I didn't need her approval anymore. Not for my place in the family, not for my worth. Spring came early that year. On the first truly warm afternoon, I opened my apartment windows wide and let the air move through the rooms. I made tea and took it out to the porch, watching the neighborhood come alive again. Kids on bikes, the mailman in shirt sleeves, a neighbor planting bright red geraniums. It struck me then that the peace I felt didn't come from winning some kind of battle. It came from not abandoning myself to keep the peace in someone else's house. I'd drawn a boundary, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, it had opened up. A few days later, my grandson called. "Grandma," he said, "when I buy my first place, will you help me pick it out?" I laughed, the sound catching me by surprise. "Of course I will. But only if you promise there will always be a room for me and my cake." He promised, and somehow I believed him. That night I set the table for one. Not because I was lonely, but because I wanted to make a ritual of it, a small celebration of my own company. I used the good plate, lit a candle, and put on the soft jazz Richard used to hum along to. As the flame flickered, I thought of that dinner, weeks ago, of the look on Claire's face when she realized I wasn't disappearing quietly, and I thought of how far I'd come from that first step into my guest room in the basement. I'd gone from being an afterthought to being the author of my own chapter. Family, I decided, isn't defined by whose name is on the invitation. It's defined by who values your presence when you arrive, and still values it when you stand your ground. I took a sip of tea, warm and steady in my hands, and said aloud to the quiet room, "Love without respect is decoration. It might look nice for a while, but it won't hold up in a storm." The candlelight danced on the wall, and I knew, in that moment, I had finally built a home that couldn't be taken from me.